The older section of the cemetery doesn't see much foot traffic these days. It's the sort of place where time settles in thick. The headstones lean a little more with each passing year. The inscriptions wear away until the names are just guesswork, and even the tree roots seem hesitant to disturb the quiet. That section is mostly from the first half of the 20th century, filled with veterans, factory workers, and homemakers, people from a different time, long past having visitors. That's where Henry Dobson is buried, in plot C-17, under a leaning pine tree. Private First Class, U.S. Army. Born 1929, died 1951. Korean War. His headstone is the standard white marble provided by the military, neatly squared with a cross etched at the top, and his name carved deep enough to remain legible through the lichen. There's nothing personal about it. No quote, no family names, no flowers. For most of my career, it was just one more forgotten grave in a forgotten corner of the cemetery. Until Memorial Day 10 years ago. It was early, just after sunrise. I had just unlocked the gates and was starting my morning rounds. The dew was still heavy on the grass, and the birds hadn't yet started their usual racket in the treetops. As I passed by C-17, something immediately caught my eye. A rose. It was long-stemmed and fresh, the kind with thick petals that look like velvet when the light hits them just right. There was no wrapping, no tag, no water tube. It was just lying flat at the base of Henry Dobson's grave, placed gently as if someone had taken their time. It stopped me in my tracks. That grave hadn't had a visitor in over 60 years. There were no records of family contact and no other names listed in the cemetery's ledger beyond the burial information. I checked the gate logs, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The grounds had been secure all night. No maintenance was scheduled, and no ceremonies were planned. The following year, it happened again. The same rose, at the same time of day, on the same grave, and the year after that. It was always on Memorial Day, and always before dawn. I began to keep track, first in my head, and then in the logbook. I noted the weather conditions, gate access, and even checked for footprints or tire tracks on the gravel roads. Nothing. Whoever was leaving that rose was either very careful, very quiet, or perhaps just not there in the way most people would expect. There's no bench near the plot, no shelter, just a clearing under a pine tree and a row of aging stones. So whoever it is, if it is a person, has to walk in there with intention. You wouldn't just stumble upon it by accident. I asked around town, spoke with the VFW, looked into local military records, and inquired at the Historical Society. Most people didn't even recognize the name Henry Dobson. A few older veterans shrugged and said they might have heard it once, maybe from their fathers, but nothing concrete. One year, I had the grounds supervisor check the camera footage. The cemetery has only one camera, and it faces the main road. It's old, motion-activated, black and white, and has a limited range. We reviewed the footage the day after Memorial Day. There was nothing. Just early morning fog and birds flitting past the lens. No movement towards Section C. After that, I stopped trying to figure it out. I started to treat it like the weather, something that just happens without needing an explanation. And now, every Memorial Day, I make sure the grounds are clean by the time the rose appears. It has become a part of the morning. Just after sunrise, I walk to C-17, and there it is. No fanfare, no change in the atmosphere, just a single rose resting by the name of a man nobody remembers. Except someone does. It's never more than one, never with a card, and it's never late. That quiet gesture has become one of the most honest parts of this job. The headstones all tell stories, but this one is still being written, even without words. Whatever the reason, whoever it is, Henry Dobson is not forgotten. Not completely. And in a place where most things are left behind, that means more than people realize. At our cemetery, we maintain a strict log for keys. It has to be done that way. There are too many liabilities, too many families we're accountable to. Keys for crypts, panels for columbariums, locks for gates. Every single one is catalogued, given a number, and signed out and in. Should you lose a key, it means a formal incident report and a safety review with the supervisor of operations. It's not an OSHA requirement, but it is the county's policy. I was part of the team that wrote that policy. So, when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, please know it wasn't a matter of carelessness. This was not a beginner's error. I have worked on this land for 26 years. This took place in my 19th year. It was early in June and already hot. One of those dry, hazy periods where you start sweating before 9 p.m. in the morning. We were getting the Boston Howell crypt ready for sealing. It was a double crypt. The upper tier had been recently occupied, while the lower tier was empty. The Howell family had put in a request for the lower drawer to be closed for good. We do that from time to time. It's either because the families have relocated or there's no heir. In this situation, they had simply come to the decision that no one else would be interred there. Closure provides peace, I suppose. I signed the crypt keys out from the main office at 6:50 a.m. on the dot. I wrote down my initials, the date, the purpose, and the asset number. It was standard procedure. Now, this particular crypt was located toward the far east side of the property, in Section H, right off the old loop road. It's situated under a line of pine trees and isn't visited often. The marble on the outside is weathered but sound, and the gate had been previously treated with a rust sealant. I had already prepared the welding equipment. This was not a new task for me. Open, inspect, verify it's empty. Weld it closed. I've done it many times. I unlocked the outer gate first. It opened as smoothly as always. The interior door was more substantial. It had a steel frame and an older lock, a Yale type. It required a bit of jiggling, but the keys worked perfectly. As soon as I was inside, I conducted the inspection. The lower drawer was clean. No rodents. No indication of any previous tampering. Everything was consistent with the records. I set the keys, which were still on the red crypt tag carabiner, on the stone ledge inside, right alongside my gloves and the sealing compound. I began to set up the welder. It took about 15 minutes to get the torch ready, clean the seam for welding, and recheck the vent seals. When I looked back, maybe 20 feet from where the keys had been, they were missing, simply gone. I stood frozen, thinking I might have knocked them off, but there was no sound of them falling, no clink. I looked on the floor, in the seal gap, on the cart, and even in my own pockets. Nothing. I checked the bag that I had brought my gloves in. Nothing. I went outside the crypt, walked back over my steps, and returned to the cart. Still nothing. I spent close to an hour looking. I even had the foreman come over. We both searched. No keys. Now, the county does not make spare keys for crypts. It's a security hazard. So, when a set is lost, especially inside the structure, you find yourself in a difficult situation. That afternoon, after we had gone over the circumstances, I submitted the loss report, and we welded the crypt shut again, this time using a cold seal compound and a full steel bond. I signed off on the closure, sent in the photos of the new weld, and noted the asset record as updated. It was sealed. That was supposed to be the end of the matter. But 2 weeks after that, on a Monday morning, first shift, I arrived just after 6:30 a.m. with a coffee in one hand and my toolbox in the other. I went into the barn where we store our equipment, and there they were, placed on my tool bench. The exact same keyring, the exact same red tag with no dust or grime on them. The brass was gleaming, not as if polished by hand, but like it had been cleaned in an ultrasonic machine. It still had a slight warmth to it, as if it had been in someone's pocket or had just been removed from a belt clip. Except no one had signed them back in. No one had been inside that crypt since the day we sealed it. The weld was untouched. I went to check it personally. Still secure, still sealed. The chain of custody log was blank. Even the security cameras showed that no one had gone into the barn during the weekend. The gate logs verified it. I did not report that they had been returned. I didn't log the keys. I just placed them in a lockbox and put a label on it that said, "Retired." They remain in that box, hidden behind old irrigation plans and broken hedge trimmers. I see them occasionally when I'm looking for line oil or a spare pair of gloves. Still warm, always just a little bit warm. And I think about that crypt and what it signifies for something to be sealed shut, truly sealed. And if some things come back on their own schedule, not on ours. Because in this line of work, you come to understand that not everything that is misplaced is lost, and not everything that is returned can be explained. Most people have the wrong idea about spring cleaning in a cemetery. It's less about flowers and good weather and more about intense manual labor, resetting stones that have sunk, clearing debris from storms, treating moss on crypt roofs, and checking the seals on older vaults to ensure time hasn't worn them down. This occurred in early April of 2019. We had just experienced a thaw, and I was assigned to the vault row on the east side. The majority of those structures go back to the early 1900s. Vaulted crypts with arched ceilings, stone walls, and old iron ventilation grates. They are sealed, but not completely airtight. They're designed to breathe, in a way, which helps keep moisture down. The crypt in this story belonged to the Harmon family. 3 interments. I had the maintenance keys, a copy of the work order, and my usual checklist. My task was to inspect the interior seam of the back wall. Some water intrusion had been reported the previous year, and we hadn't managed to get around to patching it yet. I opened the main gate and went inside. The air was cool and dry, and at first glance, everything appeared fine. Then I heard a flutter behind me. I turned to see a crow. It must have gotten in when I opened the gate. That's common enough. Birds get curious, particularly around crypts. They enjoy the shade. But this bird was different. It didn't fly around frantically like birds usually do when trapped. It remained perched on the edge of the middle coffin, an old bronze model from the 1940s, and it just stared at me. Then it made a sound that I'll never be able to forget. It wasn't a squawk or a caw, but a raw, high-pitched scream that sounded human, like a child in agony. Not just once, but over and over again. It was piercing, echoing off the stone walls of the crypt. It froze me where I stood. I've heard the screams of foxes, the wails of raccoons, and even a bobcat once near the tree line. This was none of those. This was wrong. I tried to shoo it away, but it wouldn't move. It just kept screaming. One of my co-workers, Ray, heard it from the path and came running. He paused just outside the gate and said, "That sounds like a kid. Where is that coming from?" I pointed at the bird. It shrieked again, this time louder. Ray looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. We stood there, uncertain of what our next move should be. I've handled aggressive birds before, but never one like this. And then I observed something. The bird wasn't flapping its wings. It wasn't pacing. It wasn't attempting to escape. It was waiting, looking down at the coffin beneath it. Now, that crypt had not been opened since its last interment in 1987. It was sealed tight and fully compliant. But something about that moment compelled us. I radioed my supervisor to request permission to unseal the top panel of the middle coffin. Not for an exhumation, just for an internal inspection. I mentioned a possible air pressure issue, potentially linked to the screaming bird. I didn't mention what it sounded like. We received clearance. I lifted the coffin lid slowly. It required a 2-person grip to brace the panel. Bronze is not light. The moment the seal was broken, the bird fell silent. And as we raised the lid a mere 2 inches, the crow launched into the air. It shot past my ear and out of the crypt like a bullet. It was gone. No hesitation, no flapping, just straight out through the gate and into the sky. Ray and I stood there in absolute silence. Inside the coffin, the body was intact. Minimal decomposition, just bone and old fabric. Everything was as it should have been, but the lid's interior panel, the part we had lifted, had something I did not expect to see. There were 4 deep scratches, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out, not from the outside, but from the inside. We resealed the coffin and logged the scratches on the maintenance anomaly sheet. There was no reason to contact the family, nothing to act on, just an internal note and a quiet talk between the 2 of us. That night, I went home and researched crow behavior. I learned they are known for mimicking sounds, even human voices, but that requires exposure, repetition. No one had been near that crypt in over 30 years. No one had spoken inside it above a whisper for decades, and no one, not Ray, not me, not anybody, could figure out how a bird we had never seen before mimicked the cry of a human child trapped in a sealed coffin, right up until the moment we opened it. For weeks, the abandoned cemetery on the city's edge had been sparking my curiosity. Its name written in faded ink on a fragile map I had found in the university archives. At 32, I was a historian dedicated to documenting forgotten locations, and this overgrown area, choked by weeds and hidden in the shade of twisted pines, had become my latest obsession. My work was a solitary one, fueled by a desire to safeguard the past and give a voice to those interred beneath decaying stones. That day, I had driven out by myself, with my camera around my shoulder and my notebook in hand, prepared to document the stories etched in worn granite. The air was crisp and thick with the smell of pine sap and damp soil, and the silence was so profound it seemed to vibrate. What occurred there, however, has left a knot in my stomach that I still can't explain. The cemetery was a jumble of broken headstones and knotted roots, concealed behind a rusted gate that made a sound like a pained animal as I forced it open. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the pines, creating long, sharp shadows that seemed to crawl across the uneven terrain. I was raised in a small town about an hour from here, where my mother still resides. Looking after her garden and worrying about me from a distance, she considered my fascination with old graves to be morbid and a misuse of my abilities. But it was her stories about our family's past, farmers and labourers who had made a living from this very land, that had ignited my passion for history. My brother Paul, the only family member I saw often, was back in the city, tied to his accounting desk. Our phone calls were brief and stilted, as if we were two strangers making polite conversation. This work, however, was my foundation, a way to reconnect with the heritage I had left behind, and to calm the quiet ache of feeling adrift in a fast-paced world. I began at the cemetery's perimeter, taking pictures of headstones with inscriptions that were barely readable beneath layers of moss and dirt. My camera clicked with a steady rhythm, documenting names, dates, and epitaphs, pieces of lives lost to time. I was kneeling by a weathered stone, writing down details in my notebook. Eleanor Hayes, 1847-1901, beloved mother. When a sudden crack broke the silence, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot just a short distance away. I stopped, my pen still, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was near and intentional, not the accidental snap of a branch, but the rhythm of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. I turned around, looking through the rows of graves, but I saw nothing. There were no animals, no people, just the gently swaying pines and a cloud of dust motes hanging in the dimming light. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox, but the hairs on my arms stood on end, and the air grew colder, cutting through my jacket like a knife. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my pants, and waited, listening intently. The silence came back, heavy and suffocating, but then I heard it again. Another crunch, nearer this time, perhaps 10 feet away, by a group of leaning stones that were half buried in the ground. It ceased suddenly, leaving a silence that felt like pressure on my skull. My heart pounded, and I held my camera tightly, pointing it across the cemetery. Nothing was moving, but the pines seemed to be leaning closer, their shadows extending like long fingers, the tips just touching the graves. I took a step forward, my boots sinking into the soft, loamy ground, and called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the quiet. There was no reply, only the faint sound of leaves rustling in a breeze that was too light to feel. I made myself continue working, moving to another grave, but my concentration was broken. The crunching had been too rhythmic, too human-like to be dismissed as an animal. I thought about my mother's warnings, her stories of vagrants or worse, hiding in isolated places. But I had always ignored them, relying on my instincts and the comfort of being alone. I felt at ease among the dead. Their silence was a relief from the noise of the city. But this place felt different, watchful, almost hostile, as if I had intruded on something private. I took another picture, the sound of the shutter loud in the stillness. When I looked at the screen, my breath hitched. The photo was blurry, a streak of movement cutting across it, as if something had quickly moved between the graves. I zoomed in, my fingers shaking, but the form was unclear, a dark line against the grey stones, too indistinct to identify. I looked up, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the cemetery was deserted, the shadows motionless, although they seemed to tremble at the edges of my vision. I walked through the rows, searching for any signs of another person, footprints, broken branches, anything, but I found nothing. There was just soft earth and scattered leaves, their edges dry and curled. The air became colder as I neared a nameless grave, a simple stone slab partially sunk into the ground, its surface smooth and without any markings. There was no name, no date, no indication of who was buried there. A chill came over me, sharp and immediate, like being submerged in freezing water, even though the breeze had stopped. My skin tingled, and the knot in my stomach tightened, a deep, visceral feeling that was almost physical, like a hand touching my spine. I moved back, my camera feeling heavy, and continued my work. But every sound, a rustling leaf, a far-off bird, made me jump. I thought of Paul and how he would mock my nervousness, calling me overly dramatic, but he wasn't here. The silence of the cemetery felt like it was closing in, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I remained until dusk, as the light faded to a flat grey. The pines threw deeper, more angular shadows that appeared to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The crunching sound did not return, but the chill persisted, especially near the unmarked grave. Its presence was a weight I couldn't get rid of. I tried to stay focused, taking pictures of more stones, but my hands were unsteady, and my notes were disorganized, my writing sharp and uneven. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something in the encroaching darkness. My mother's voice replayed in my mind, her stories of places that held onto their past too strongly, places that did not welcome visitors. I had always thought of her as superstitious, attached to old-fashioned fears, but now a cold, persistent doubt began to form. My work was based on facts, dates, names, records, but this cemetery felt alive, its pulse beating beneath the ground, hidden but palpable. I stayed longer than I should have, feeling drawn to the nameless grave despite the unease it caused. I walked around it slowly, my flashlight now on, its beam faint and flickering, barely cutting through the twilight. The ground was soft and uneven, as if it had been disturbed long ago, the soil looser than the compacted earth around the other graves. I told myself it was just erosion or roots pushing up, but that explanation didn't bring me any comfort. I took one final photo, the flash bright against the darkness. When I checked it, the screen showed only the grave. No blur, no shadow, just cold, empty stone. Still, the chill stayed with me, sinking into my bones, and the knot in my stomach felt heavier, like I had ingested something sharp. I gathered my things quickly, my bag feeling heavier than usual, my actions clumsy in the growing dark. The gate moaned as I shut it, the sound echoing like a final warning. I walked to my car, the pines looming in my peripheral vision, their branches swaying even though the air was still. The drive back was quiet, the radio was off, and the engine's hum was too faint to block out the memory of the crunching sound and the chill. The pines seemed to be following me, their shadows flickering in my rearview mirror, and the road felt more constricting, the darkness pressing in as if trying to hold me there. I thought of my mother, and how she had pleaded with me to work on safer projects, to stay away from old graves. She had always been overprotective, her phone calls full of questions about my well-being, her voice tense with anxiety. I thought of Paul, how he would have rolled his eyes at my story, blaming it on my overactive imagination, but he would still send me a text later, checking on me without saying so. The cemetery was supposed to be my haven, a place where I could connect with the past and find purpose in the stories I brought to light. But now, it felt like a stranger, its secrets buried too deeply to uncover, too heavy to bear. Back home, I transferred the photos to my laptop, looking through them with all the lights on. The hum of the apartment did little to ward off the unease. The blurry picture was there, a smudge of movement that made my heart race. I tried to enhance it, adjusting the contrast and brightness, but it remained indistinct, a shape that could have been a trick of the light or something more. I zoomed in until the image pixelated, looking for clarity that wasn't there. The photo felt like a taunt, a brief look at something I was never meant to see. I shut the laptop, my hands cold, and sat in the silence, the memory of the unmarked grave weighing on my mind. I thought of my father, who had left when I was young. His absence was a shadow I had never fully escaped. My mother had filled that void with stories, and this work was my way of keeping them alive, of proving that I could achieve something on my own. But now, the cemetery had left its own mark on me, a weight I couldn't define. I continued my work, visiting other locations and documenting other graves, but I never went back to that cemetery. Its map remained in my desk drawer, the ink looking darker each time I saw it. I tried to concentrate on my research and the articles I was writing, but the crunching sound stayed with me, faint in my dreams, a rhythm that would wake me up in a sweat. The chill from that nameless grave lingered, a quiet sense of unease that settled deep in my bones, heavy and unshakable. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, a moment of paranoia, but the memory of that blurred photograph and that empty stone slab has remained with me, a question without an answer, a shadow that never fades. In every cemetery, there's a section that people speak of in a slightly different way. For us, it's the old crypt row, located in the farthest back part, where the gravel path gives way to grass and the headstones become thin. We refer to it as the ridge, though it's hardly an incline, just enough of a rise to keep the ground dry. The crypts up there are older, constructed between 1880 and 1920. They are stone and iron structures, all of which were sealed decades ago. The families have mostly moved away or passed on. Some of those names no longer receive flowers, only time and weather. It's there that people claim to have seen the lantern. I first heard about it when I was still new, maybe 6 months into the job. A local woman flagged me down while I was loading mulch bags into the truck. She wanted to know if we had installed new lighting up by the old crypts. I explained to her, no, we've never run electric lines that far out. She nodded slowly, saying, well, something is up there walking with a light. I dismissed it as a car's reflection, or maybe some kids with a flashlight. But as the years went on, more reports surfaced. The description was always the same. A small, faint golden light, flickering, spotted around dusk, moving between the crypts as if someone were walking a path. It was never too bright or fast, just steady, like an old lantern being carried low to the ground. No one has ever managed to get a close look at it. There are no photos, no trail markers. It doesn't appear on our CCTV, though those cameras don't cover that far back. The county budget has its limits. I've walked that section hundreds of times, sometimes with a spade, sometimes with a rake, and sometimes just to check that the stones aren't sinking. I have never seen it myself, not head on. But one evening, I think I might have. It was a cold but clear November. I had stayed after my shift to finish raking up leaf buildup behind the last crypt wall. I recall the light was fading fast, that quick kind of autumn dimness. As I was packing up my tools, I caught something from the corner of my eye, out past the third crypt near the cedar tree. A soft pulse of light, low to the ground, like a hand shielding a flame. I looked up. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, but the light felt real. It wasn't imagined or a trick of the eye. I've worked through too many seasons to confuse sunlight with firelight. I didn't mention it. Not to the other guys and not in the log. But I began to pay more attention to that area. I went through the old burial records and discovered something strange. Back in the early 1900s, a caretaker by the name of Elias Rudd worked these very same grounds. There isn't much written about him, just a few notes in handwritten logs, but he is mentioned as having lived in the small caretaker's shed near the crypt ridge. He maintained those mausoleums by hand, lived by himself, and died of pneumonia in 1921. And this is the part that made me stop. His obituary, clipped and yellowed in the local archive, called him the last lantern man. That's what they referred to him as. It said he made his evening rounds carrying a kerosene lantern and a pocketbook of names, double-checking seals and inscriptions by hand, even when nobody asked him to. It said he felt a responsibility for the quiet ones, those whose families had stopped visiting. People said he used to hum as he walked, nothing loud, just a tune under his breath. They said the light always moved slowly, as if he wanted the dead to know he was nearby. I kept that article and taped it to the inside of my locker. I can't say for sure what people are seeing on that ridge, but I have a feeling it isn't something bad. I think it's just someone making their rounds, still checking, still walking, and still carrying that light. In Ohio, I'm on a 3-person crew for historic preservation. We work mostly in old cemeteries, a few of which go back to the early 1800s. The work of restoration isn't glamorous. It requires patience, it can even be tedious. We handle everything from broken headstones and erosion to frost heaves, lichen, and even acts of vandalism. But now and then, you're tasked with more than just upkeep. Now and then, you're tasked with opening something up. This particular story is from 2016, at a small Lutheran cemetery in the northern part of the state. A family-operated place, situated between cornfields and old gravel roads. They had managed to get a grant to restore 2 of their most ancient mausoleums. One was for the Dietrich family, and the other was the Howell Crypt. This story is about the Howell site. It was a granite crypt with a date of 1869, featuring hand-carved columns and a door of rusted iron. It wasn't elaborate, but it possessed that classic 19th century stillness. It was the type of structure that had held up well on the outside, but had not been opened for more than 140 years. The descendants of the family, in collaboration with the Preservation Board, provided official consent for a structural inspection and an assessment of the interior. That was our job, and it meant we had to go inside. I can recall the day with perfect clarity. It was the middle of September, warm for an autumn day, a gentle breeze, not a single cloud to be seen. We had a structural engineer from a third party on site, along with a county historian and a supervisor from the Ohio Cemetery Alliance who were there to observe. Inside, it was musty, but it was all intact. The humidity had found its way in over the decades, but the coffin, which rested on a stone pedestal, was not disturbed. It was a burial case made of cast iron lined with lead, which was a popular choice in the era after the Civil War for families with more means. It had airtight seals, was heavy, and was adorned with ornate reliefs. There was a nameplate, Clara Howell, 1838-1872. There was no indication of disturbance, no damage from insects, no signs of rodents. The seals had obviously held. But as a component of the restoration and with proper legal authorization, we had the duty to inspect the coffin's state, primarily to check for any risk of collapse or contamination. We cut the bolts around the perimeter with a specialized rotary tool. It was a slow process. The lead casing on the inside, which was fused to the outer iron layer, had become as hard as a rock. Finally, we lifted the lid up carefully with padded lift brackets, and it was at that moment that we saw the scratches. There were dozens of them, and they were deep. They seemed random at first, but then they became more concentrated, clustered over the area where the torso would have been. Jagged, crescent-shaped marks, parallel gouges, not shallow, but panicked. We all stood there in silence, not because of any superstition, but out of respect. The body was intact. The skeletal remains were in a state consistent with a peaceful decomposition. There were no indications of trauma. Still wearing burial clothes, with hands crossed, everything was as it should be. Nothing had been moved. There were no broken bones, no sign of a struggle apart from what was on the lid's underside. The pathologist we had brought in stated that the nails on both hands were not broken. There were no bone fractures, no clawing motion from the hands or dislocation of the joints. His most educated guess was that pre-burial muscle spasms, or the movement of gas, had caused her limbs to twitch against the lid during the initial phases of decomposition. He said, "Sometimes gases can expand the lungs and the chest, which creates pressure." He said, "It might have been misinterpreted as movement from the inside, but I've been at this for a long time. I have lifted hundreds of lids, and that did not look like it was from gas." The historian offered a different idea. She mentioned that in 1872, embalming was not a widespread practice in rural counties. She spoke of catalepsy, a medical condition that can resemble death, and that it was a source of fear. She said some families would bury their deceased with bells or breathing tubes. She mentioned that there were articles in newspapers from that period that warned about premature burials. I conducted some research later on. Clara Howell did not have an obituary. There was no record of a funeral in the local parish's archive. There was only an entry in a cemetery ledger from May 1872. Female, age 34. Cause of death, unknown fever. We resealed the coffin with respect. We recorded every single detail. We welded the casing shut again using modern materials. And we officially marked the restoration as finished. But I still find myself thinking about those scratches, about the loudness of a scream when no one is there to hear it, and about how history can sometimes leave behind claw marks. It's a common belief that the creepiest things in a cemetery occur at night, but that isn't always the case. Some of the incidents that stick with you happen in broad daylight, and when everything is supposed to make sense. Back in 2021, I was in Chicago on a contract to help with seasonal maintenance at a large, historic cemetery on the north side. The place was immense, with over 150,000 burials, crypt corridors, mausoleums, and family vaults in every corner. It was a blend of city history and personal stories. You could walk through 140 years of history without ever leaving the East Wing. Recently, the cemetery had begun a collaboration with the local historical society, which consisted mainly of older volunteers helping to catalogue names, clean markers, and document crypt changes for their digital archive. One Saturday, my assignment was to supervise a small group as they documented the interior of Crypt Hall 4, one of the older vaulted corridors near the lake. They had a fairly professional setup. One handheld camera with night vision, one lapel mic on their lead volunteer, and a GoPro-style camera running passively to document the layout and spacing. They were history buffs, not ghost hunters, with permission to conduct digital preservation. There were 5 of us in total that morning. Myself, 3 volunteers, and their lead, a woman named Ruth. She was in her mid-60s, quiet and focused, and always wore thick denim gloves, even when it wasn't cold. We went into Hall 4 just before 10 a.m. The air was cold, as it always is, even in summer. The structure was limestone with heavy marble panels, no natural light, no HVAC, and no electricity. In previous years, they used hand-pumped lanterns, but we now used battery-powered lights on carts. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred during the inspection. Ruth narrated as they walked, reading names from the plates, noting chisel marks, 1890s rivet patterns, and decay on zinc hardware. Her voice echoed slightly, but no more than you'd expect. They spent about 40 minutes in there. Afterward, we locked the place up, logged the time, and moved on to another wing. At the end of the day, I signed their paperwork, and they thanked me. I didn't think about it again. 2 days later, Ruth called my supervisor to request a follow-up. It wasn't because of something she saw, but something she heard. She had gone back to listen to the audio from her GoPro, wanting to match names to locations for the index, but something faint in the background stood out. It wasn't talking, or the wind, or a rustling sound. It was crying, faint, slow, drawn out and uneven, the kind of crying you don't even realize you're hearing at first. It wasn't loud. It was underneath her voice, just audible enough to feel wrong. What made it even stranger was that no one had heard it during the actual tour. Not a single person mentioned it. And trust me, if we had heard crying inside a sealed corridor, someone would have spoken up. Ruth sent the file to us. We listened. We had to turn the volume way up and isolate the track, but once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. It sounded like a child, not wailing or being dramatic, just soft, breathy weeping, muffled, as if it were echoing from inside the stone itself. Now, this is the part that gave me pause. Ruth's narration at that exact moment. She was reading from a nameplate. Thomas Weiland, age 4, died 1901, influenza. The crying began just before she read his name and stopped the moment she finished. We checked the equipment. There was no malfunction, no audio overlays. The ambient microphone was clean. There was no interference from other devices. Ruth's team is meticulous. They document everything, down to their battery changes. We asked the operations lead if this kind of thing had ever happened before. He didn't seem surprised at all and just said that Hall 4 has a history like that, and that was it. No one asked for the footage to be deleted. No one demanded an explanation. It was simply filed away, much like we file reports of rusted hinges, warped panel doors, and crypts that settle a bit too far to the left. Ruth continues to do volunteer work at the cemetery. She no longer brings that recorder, just a clipboard. And when we walk through Hall 4 now, we don't talk above a whisper. Not out of fear, but because maybe, just maybe, someone is still listening. I've been a gravekeeper at Greenwood Rest for more than 26 years now. This cemetery covers about 10 acres on the edge of a quiet town in the Midwest, just past the tree line and surrounded by a fence that is more rust than metal. At this point, we don't get many visitors after sunset, and I'm usually the only one still walking the grounds as the light fades. That's the part of the job I've grown to appreciate the most. It's when the noise of the day dies down and everything feels settled, honest. But a couple of years ago, during the late fall, something different began to happen. It started about a week after we buried a man named Patrick Holden. Patrick was a retired canine handler who had worked with local law enforcement for over 3 decades. People around here respected him. His funeral was well attended, a neat ceremony. We placed him in Section D, Row 12, Lot 8, between an old Navy veteran and a woman who used to bake pies for every church event in town. I remember it clearly because I was the one who helped lower the casket and cover it. Patrick's headstone was modest, etched with his name, badge number, and a small emblem of a German shepherd engraved just below the dates. No dramatic epitaph, just quiet dignity. About 4 days after the funeral, I was doing my usual walkthrough just before closing the gates when I saw a dog at the far end of the cemetery. He wasn't running or digging. He was just sitting at the foot of Patrick's grave, head down, as still as a stone. Now, stray dogs aren't unheard of out here. We're bordered by woods on 2 sides, and sometimes they wander in looking for scraps, but they usually run off when they see me. Not this one. I stood about 20 feet back and watched. He didn't growl or bark or even glance in my direction. He just kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I didn't go near him that first night. I just finished locking up and left him be, figuring he would be gone by morning, but he wasn't. The next evening, I came back around the same time, and there he was again. Same grave, same posture, like a soldier keeping watch. I finally got close enough to see that he was an older dog. Some kind of shepherd mix, maybe. He had black and grey fur and was a little worn around the snout. He looked well fed, not feral, but he had no collar and no tags, just eyes that felt knowing, calm, but tired. Over the next few nights, it became a routine. He would show up just before dusk and lie down near Patrick's grave. Rain, wind, cold, it didn't matter. He never missed a night. I started bringing an old wool blanket from the shed and laying it near the headstone, but he never touched it. He wouldn't eat anything either. I tried boiled chicken, beef jerky, and even a couple of hot dogs. He never so much as sniffed them. He wasn't there for food. He was there for him. I asked around and talked to a few officers who had attended the funeral. One of them said that Patrick's last K9 partner had been a shepherd named Duke, who had retired a year before Patrick passed. He said Duke had been given to a foster family after Patrick's stroke since no relatives could take him in, but no one knew where the dog had ended up. Another officer swore he saw Duke at the funeral, saying the family had brought him for the service but took him home right after. But no one could confirm where home was. I started keeping a small log, marking the dates. For 14 nights in a row, that dog came, always just before sunset and always gone by first light. He never caused any damage and never made a sound. On the 15th night, he didn't come. I waited, walked the grounds 3 times and checked the tree line. I even left the gate open a little longer than usual, but he never showed up. The next morning, I found paw prints in the frost leading up to the grave. There were no prints walking away. That was 2 years ago. I never saw him again after that. I didn't tell anyone about that last part. I figured it wouldn't matter. People believe what they want to believe. Some would say it was just a coincidence. Others might say it was grief in animal form, a bond that outlived the man. I don't know. But I kept the wool blanket. I folded it up and placed it in the shed, right next to the flower buckets and the rusted spades. Every now and then, I take it out, shake the dust off, and run my hand over it, because I think loyalty like that deserves to be remembered. Not just marked in stone, but kept. Just like that dog did for 14 nights. For one man, in silence, in stillness, and in a love that didn't ask for anything in return. Some things you only speak aloud a single time, and then you let them rest quietly where they should. This is one such thing. For nearly 24 years, I've been a groundskeeper at a cemetery in southeast Alabama. It's a small, county-operated cemetery, around 60 acres, with a mix of historic and modern sections. We look after just over 8,000 graves, 3 columbarium walls, and a half-dozen family crypts. The work is good, it's honest. I enjoy the routine. I enjoy that it has meaning, even if the majority of people don't notice it. The Pharaoh family crypt is situated on the West Ridge. It has a granite facade, unassuming but tasteful. It was built in 1942 and refurbished on 2 occasions. The first time was after storm damage in the 70s, and the second was in the early 2000s after the last of the pharaohs had passed away. I am familiar with the history because I have been in that crypt many, many times. I'm the one who inspects for moss, leaks, and signs of pests every fall and every spring like clockwork. This occurred 4 years back in late March. We were getting ready for the Memorial Day season, which is our busiest time. Every single bench needed to be pressure washed, every vase set upright, every single structure inspected, and its maintenance needs documented. I had left the Pharaoh crypt for the end of the day. It sits on the upper part of the hill overlooking the tree line, and it takes more time due to the incline. When I finally made it up there, it was past 5 hours PM. My colleagues had already gone home for the day. I had about 45 minutes of daylight remaining, but I didn't have a problem with staying late. I had my inspection checklist and my set of keys. The crypt is designed with a front vestibule that has a steel security gate, followed by an inner door with glass panels. I unlocked them both and went inside, just as I had on 100 other occasions. It was cool and still had the scent of stone and old flowers. I moved along the interior. 6 crypt drawers, 3 located on each side, all of them occupied. The nameplates are straightforward. Mr. and Mrs. Pharaoh, their children, and a son-in-law. all of whom passed away before 2005. There are no fresh flowers anymore, only silk arrangements that have faded but have kept their shape. I was about halfway done checking the interior seams when I heard it, as clearly as if a person was standing right behind me. A whisper, just 2 words, my full name. Not hey, not sir, not the wind being misheard. My first and last name. No nickname, no indistinct mumble. I turned around right away. The vestibule behind me was completely empty. I went back through the doorway and looked all around the exterior. No cars in sight, no sign of movement. I even scanned the gravel road that went down the hill. Nothing. I was the only one left on the grounds. I am unable to explain the voice. I can't even describe it very well. It wasn't masculine, it wasn't feminine, it was just clear, like breath and purpose without any physical form. I remained standing there for quite some time. I didn't even complete the checklist. I relocked the crypt, put my tools away in the cart, and began the slow walk to the utility barn. I didn't mention it to the other guys. I didn't record it in the notes. I simply clocked out. Later that night, I told my wife. I was anticipating her to laugh, but she did not. She just paid attention and then said, "Perhaps somebody remembered you." I wasn't sure what to say to that. I have returned to the Pharaoh crypt many times since then. Nothing out of the ordinary has ever happened again. Not a whisper, not a gust of wind, only quiet. But now I always knock 3 times before I go inside, not because I'm afraid, but out of respect. Some people believe cemeteries are all about the past, but when you work in them for a long time, you realize they are also about presence, about how names hold significance, and about how the act of remembering someone has a real weight to it. And every now and then, just now and then, something remembers you in return. Having worked security in grounds for this long, I know that most strange reports have perfectly simple explanations. Light reflections, lens flares, raccoons, faulty wiring. 9 times out of 10, you troubleshoot the issue, document it, and move on. But every once in a while, you encounter that 10th case. This took place at a cemetery complex where I worked outside of Kansas City, one of the larger memorial parks in the area. It has over 60,000 plots, several indoor mausoleums, a columbarium wing, and an adjacent funeral chapel. It's the kind of place that operates like a small city. Covering that much ground means we have to rely heavily on our CCTV system. 88 cameras in total, most of them motion-triggered with auto-vision. The mausoleum in this story, Building D, is an indoor, corridor-style structure with a sealed entry and passcode access after hours, and it's climate-controlled. The vaults are stacked 2 high along each wall, with bronze panel doors and concrete housing behind them. The hallway is long with a marble floor softly lit, and even your own breath echoes. Camera D4 was mounted at ceiling level at the east end of the corridor, angled to see the full length of the hallway. It's one of the few cameras we keep on constant record because of some vandalism incidents years ago. I was conducting a routine review of footage from a Friday night. A mild power surge had occurred during a storm, and I needed to verify that all the motion alerts were false positives. I located the timestamp and started the review. That's when I saw it. At 3:12 a.m., a motion alert on camera D4. The playback began like any other nightly feed. Grainy, grayscale, with no movement for the first few seconds. And then I saw it, about 40 feet down the hallway, right in the center. 2 small points of light. Initially, I thought it was dust reflecting an IR beam, or maybe light reflecting off water, but the placement was too exact. They were at a height of roughly 4.5 feet from the ground, spaced apart like eyes. They didn't glow or move. They just reflected, and then they blinked. They didn't fade or disappear, they blinked. It was clean, mechanical, and unmistakable, both eyes at the same time. And then they were gone. The feed continued with no flicker, no distortion, nothing else. I checked the logs. No entry code had been used. There were no open door alerts, no HVC disturbances, and no internal sensors had been triggered. I also pulled the exterior footage. Nothing had entered or exited the building for over 6 hours before or after the event. The next step was internal protocol. We inspected the interior for any animal access, every vent grate, every gap in the floor. We even had a pest control expert come in the following Monday. There were no droppings, no hair, and no signs of nesting. The space was sealed. We keep it clean, we always have. Still, animals can be surprising. So, I ran it by the facilities manager, thinking it might be a raccoon or a possum. He watched the footage and didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Those are not animal eyes. Notice how they stay level. See how long they hold still. And he was right. Whatever it was didn't jitter, wobble, or pace like most animals caught on night vision. It stared, almost as if it was aware the camera was there, and then it blinked. That was 4 years ago. We still have the footage in our archives, redacted for any public access. Every now and then, a new guard will ask if anything odd ever appears on the mausoleum feeds. I don't bring it up, but if they ask specifically about D4, I show them the file. They always lean closer. They always go quiet when the blink happens. And not one of them has ever volunteered to do the night walkthrough in Building D after seeing it. I don't believe it was a threat, and I don't think it meant to be seen, but it did look back. That's the part that sticks with you.